Hi. Welcome. So this is the heart of American politics right here, and this is it was in a heartbeat. When I got the invitation, I said I'd love to come. I've spent a ton of time here over the years. We were just my old Bush alums here were talking about. I have a scarf. It's one of my favorite keepsakes from 2000, and it says "Reason for Freezin'." New Hampshire, 2000. And so I have so many great memories of being in the state and campaigning for John McCain and for George Bush. And you know, I don't think you've really even come close to experiencing American politics unless you've been in New Hampshire. So you are, we appreciate what you do for the American political system. I think it's vital to have the first primaries and caucuses in Iowa and New Hampshire. I think it makes a big difference on how people campaign. I know there's a lot of talk about changing that. I hope it doesn't change, because I know it's very healthy for candidates to come here and have to talk to voters one-on-one. It makes a big difference. That's so much, and have to answer questions directly. So I think it's a great filter on the process. So I love American politics, which is why I love New Hampshire. And everything about it, and I've learned a lot over the years, and I've learned a lot from winning campaigns. I've learned even more from losing campaigns. In fact, I'd say that I learned more from campaigns that I lost than campaigns that you win. Losing campaigns really hurts. You know, you put your life and soul into something, and it's just a crushing experience when you lose. And of course, it's great to win, but when you lose, you just say, I don't ever want that feeling again. So. Some time ago, well, let me back up even further. George W. Bush asked me to be his chief media guy in 2000 and to do all the advertising for that campaign. And I was at first really excited, and then I was petrified because I'd never done it before. And it was a huge responsibility, and it scared me. And so I said, I better learn a lot fast. And so I spent a bunch of time going back to the origins of American political media and advertising, which was really started with Dwight Eisenhower. And I studied it, and I went and talked to the people who were still living that did those campaigns and just soaked up as much as I could. And I saw some really interesting patterns and things that emerged as I observed all of this. And then I sat down with a friend of mine who I'm going to talk about a little bit later. His name is Paul Begala. Paul has probably been up here before. He's a well-known political does a lot of political commentary, and he's a former political consultant who worked for Bill Clinton. Paul and I went to school together in Austin at the University of Texas, and then he worked for Bill Clinton, I worked for George Bush, and then we later were in a firm together. And so when we were in that firm, we sat down with each other and said, let's do an exercise. Let's go back through all the winning campaigns that we've done and distill what it is that every winning campaign does. And we created a presentation. It's kind of like if you've ever seen the book, The Highly Effective Habits of Successful People. This is like the highly effective habits of successful campaigns. And so it's been really interesting to do that over time. And one lesson about any communications, especially in politics, is that nothing is static. And campaigns that look in the rearview mirror and see what worked before are the campaigns that often are the losing campaigns. So it's important in all of this to always be thinking about not what's happened before, but what's the next thing that's going to happen? What's the next evolution of communications and strategy? And as a really good example, just look to last year. I mean, on November 9th, the day after the election, as I was about to go give a presentation like this somewhere, I thought, oh my God, I've got to throw out half of what I thought I knew. Because, you know, there were several of those things that were in that original presentation that Donald Trump just threw out the window and kind of rewrote the rule book. So I'm going to just do an amended version of what I call how to win. And this is how campaigns win. And by the way, these lessons apply, this is through a political lens, but it applies to any organization, NGO, nonprofit, any organization that seeks to communicate its mission or its message, which is, when you think about it, just about any organization except for maybe the CIA. So The most important thing for any candidate or campaign is to articulate a clear rationale. Why are you running? Really simple, really obvious, right? You'd think you wouldn't even need to mention that. Why are you running? But you look at failed campaigns, and often at the core of a failed campaign is a failure to communicate a rationale, and winning campaigns articulate a very clear and compelling rationale. So in 1979, Jimmy Carter was president of the United States. He was terribly weakened for a lot of reasons: bad economy, hostages in Iran. And the Democrats smartly, although painfully, admitted to themselves, if we run this guy for re-election, we're probably going to lose. And they were right, as it turned out. But at that time, they said, well, let's run a candidate against our own president in a primary. Let's primary our own president, which was unheard of, I think, at least in recent history. And they decided that that person would be Ted Kennedy. He's the obvious guy, had the name, had the money. There was one big problem. The problem was an incident called Chappaquiddick. Chappaquiddick was a tragic event in which a woman lost her life. Kennedy was driving the car. Alcohol was involved. Really bad deal. But it happened some time ago. But they knew when he announced for president that would be relitigated, that all the journalists would want to talk to him about that. So they said, we need a strategy to deal with that. And it was a very smart one. And they said, let's get... rather than do dozens and dozens of interviews with lots of different media outlets talking about the subject, let's just do one and do it exclusively. In other words, we'll let 60 Minutes, which is seen as credible and tough, and we'll let them ask every question they want to about this. Every single one. We'll let the interview go as long as they want. And then when it's done, somebody asks about it, we'll say, watch 60 Minutes. Asked and answered. So that was a good strategy. And they briefed up Ted Kennedy for weeks and weeks. 60 Minutes comes up, they do the interview. It goes on for like 2.5 hours, and the advisors are in the back of the room high-fiving each other because Kennedy's killing it, just knocking every question out of the park very confidently. And at the end of the interview, as everybody is celebrating in the back, the interviewer, Roger Mudd, very casually asks Kennedy, really not even intending to have anything to do with the interview, so why are you running for president? And here's the moment captured on 60 Minutes, the deer in the headlights moment. We know he's going, God, we didn't think about that one. Here it is. It's the rationale question. Why are you running?
Why do you want to be president? Well, were I to make the announcement to run, the reasons that I would run is because I have a great belief in this country that there's more natural resources than any nation in the world. There's the greatest educated population in the world, the greatest technology of any country in the world, and the greatest capacity for innovation in the world, and the greatest political system in the world.
Not so good. Not so good. In fact, not just bad, but think about it. He's the challenger, challenging an incumbent president, and challengers should have a message about change. Right? You want to do something different than what's going on. And what does he do? He says, everything's going great. Great education system, great natural system, great this, great that. What he articulated was a message to re-elect Jimmy Carter. Right? That was Carter's re-election message. And the campaign melted down because of a failure to articulate a rationale. Okay, here's a guy who thought about it a little bit more.
Every time I speak about my hope for America, the cynics in Washington roll their eyes. You see, they don't believe we can actually change politics and bring an end to decades of division and deadlock. They don't believe we can limit the power of lobbyists who block our progress, but that we can trust the American people with the truth. And that's why we face the same problems and hear the same promises every 4 years. My experience tells me something very different. In 20 years of public service, I've brought Democrats and Republicans together to solve problems that touch the lives of everyday people. I've taken on the drug and insurance companies and won. I defied the politics of the moment and opposed the war in Iraq before it began. This is Barack Obama. I approve this message to ask you to believe not just in my ability to bring about real change in Washington. I'm asking you to believe in yours.
Fantastic, right? Clear, compelling rationale. There's a reason that guy was elected to be president of the United States twice, right? Okay, so but that's 75 words in 1 minute. Now here's somebody doing it in 4 words.
And we will make America great again. God bless you and good night.
Okay, so whether you agree with it or not, that is a clear rationale. And he was so certain about that rationale, he copyrighted those 4 words the day after the 2012 election. He was so clear about that rationale. Okay, so, and he's running against somebody on the other side, Hillary Clinton, who had arguably been thinking about this longer than just about anybody who's ever run for president, right? She's first lady in the Senate, had run before in 2008, been Secretary of State, and yet, look what happens when she goes to announce. And this is by the authors of a book about the campaign from the Washington Post. This is their observation. Okay, they're at the announcement. Here's the announcement speech. And what happens? No overarching narrative explaining her candidacy. Hillary had been running for president for almost a decade and still didn't really have a rationale, okay? So, failure to articulate a rationale. And you look back at the campaign, clearly part of the problem for Hillary Clinton and part of the success of Donald Trump. Telling a story. So we usually think about storytelling in terms of culture, film, movies, books. It's just as important in campaigns. Good campaigns tell a story. And what does that mean? It means that there's a narrative architecture to it. Voters don't want just random pieces of information. They want somebody to tie it together for them so it has a greater meaning. So when Paul and I have worked for campaigns, we talk about the importance of a campaign telling a story. So what does that mean in a campaign? What does that mean in politics? Well, we propose a filter that we try and talk about with the campaigns and the candidates that goes like this. You identify a threat or an opportunity out there, or both. There's a threat making people's lives worse, or there's an opportunity that could make them better because you're running to do something. Otherwise, you're like Kennedy's message, and you're just, if you're not running to do something, why are you running? Right? So you're running to increase opportunity or diminish threats. Identify the victims of those denied opportunities or imposed threats. Who is losing out or who is not gaining from the opportunity? Identify who that is. Identify the villain or villains. And it's not necessarily a person. It could be a government, a bureaucracy, a regulatory system, something that is imposing the threat or denying the opportunity. Propose a solution, reveal the hero. That's just a classic narrative architecture. And so then the candidates will often say, that's okay, sounds smart, but I don't quite get it. Can you show me an example of somebody doing that? Simply. And we say, sure. For example, here is Ronald Reagan doing what I just described in a very famous ad called The Bear in the Woods. Now, there's a few people here that may be as old as I am, but for those of you who may be younger, it's important to know that the bear in 1980 was a metaphor for the Soviet Union. And this ad features a bear. But think about that filter that I just described and how this ad does what I just described as the filter.
There's a bear in the woods. For some people, the bear is easy to see. Others don't see it at all. Some people say the bear is tame. Others say it's vicious and dangerous. Since no one can really be sure who's right, isn't it smart to be as strong as the bear? If there is a bear.
There it is. Perfect narrative architecture in a great ad that had a clear narrative arc to it. So, again, think about the last campaign, whether you, I'm not making an editorial judgment here, but I'm just making a judgment on who was the better storyteller. Okay, I can tell you pretty easily what Donald Trump's story was. Identify the opportunity. Make America great again. Identify the threat. Mexican immigrants, other immigrants, Chinese trade deals, the elites in Washington. Identify the victim. Identify the victims. Who are the victims? Well, the victims are largely middle-class Americans who have either lost jobs or have a diminishing quality of life as jobs have gone overseas. Identify so we got the threat, we got the opportunity, we have the victim. The villain is, of course, the Mexican immigrants, the Chinese, the media, and then the solution is build a wall, tear up the trade deals, drain the swamp. The hero is Donald Trump. And so it's a clear narrative architecture and storyline. And there's just, to this day, I've been unable to figure out what Hillary Clinton's was. So she didn't articulate a rationale, nor did she tell a clear story. The other challenge that campaigns have, and anybody communicating in a modern environment, is the window that you have to communicate is so tight. And just to give you an example of how tight that is and what a challenge that is, in 1968, when Richard Nixon ran for president, the average amount of time that a candidate would get on television after a speech or a press conference for Nixon in 1968, during that presidential campaign, was 47 seconds. Okay, doesn't seem like a whole lot of time, but in the last campaign for Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, the average amount of time they got on network news in the last campaign was 7 seconds. 7 seconds. So think about that. So if you're working with a candidate or a CEO or somebody trying to communicate a message, you sit down and you say, okay, Mr. Governor, Senator, President, whoever, you've got your climate change speech tomorrow. And they're great. I've been working on this for months. I'm so excited. I feel so strongly about this issue. And you say, and you've got to articulate your message in 7 seconds. And they say, well, that's ridiculous. I'm a really smart person. And this is a really complicated subject. And I am not going to dumb it down so that people, because it's too complicated. And so the reason I have a goldfish here is that Microsoft did a study a couple of years ago in which they determined that the average attention span of a goldfish is 9 seconds. All right? The average attention span of a human being, 8. 8 seconds, okay? So suddenly the 7-second thing kind of makes sense, right? So the candidate says, that's ridiculous, it's too complicated, I can't dumb it down like that, and that's exactly what Bill Clinton said to my friend Paul in 1992. During that campaign, they were preparing for the debate, and Paul asked him a question about the balanced budget amendment, which was a big issue at the time. And 25 minutes into his answer, Paul stops him and says, Governor, you don't have 25 minutes, you have 3. And Clinton said, Paul, it's very complicated issue. And started arguing with him and said, you know, I can't do it. And Paul said, well, then you lose. And Clinton said, well, smarty pants, show me an issue this complicated that can be articulated in the way that you're describing. And Paul said, okay. And he pulled out a small Bible out of his pocket that he used to carry around, maybe he still does, that he bought when we were at the University of Texas on what we call the drag there. And he pulled it out and he opened it to a very famous biblical passage, John 3:16. And he handed it to Clinton, and he said, okay, Governor, read this. So Clinton reads it, and then Paul has his watch out, and he says, okay, Governor, there, in 25 words lasting 6.8 seconds, St. John listed all the essentials of Christian theology, all of them. Let me break it down for you. For God, monotheism, not the gods, just God. It took humanity hundreds of thousands of years to come to the conclusion that there's only one supreme being, and John 3:16 covers all that ground in 2 words and a fraction of a second. So loved the world. God is not only singular and supreme, but also benevolent, capable of affection on a global scale. Okay, so God's a guy. If that offends you, take it up with the author. Gave his only begotten son. Okay, he has a son, a begotten one at that, and God is willing to ship him to earth as a gift. That's an enormously complicated concept, fraught with ramifications, but delivered in just 5 words. So that whoever believes in him, having faith in the Son as a prerequisite to what comes next, shall not die, but have everlasting life. That's the payoff. Faith triumphs over everything, even death. No wonder believers call this the good news. So again, for the older folks in the audience, you may remember in the old days when they had particularly NFL football games, there was a guy with a rainbow afro that would always show up at the game holding a sign that said John 3:16. And the cameras would always find him because he was just an interesting character with this big rainbow afro. And he'd hold up John 3:16. And so this is the modern day version. You know who this is? Tim Tebow, right. So famous athlete. This is when he won the college national championship. So so he's the modern day version of the guy with the afro because he goes into this game and he has a few thoughts on his mind. 1, I think we're going to win. 2, when we win, I'm going to be on TV. And 3, when I'm on TV, I've got something I want to say that has nothing to do with football. And so what does he do? He puts John 3:16 into the eye black under his eyes. And what happens when people see that? Well, they either know what it is, or if they don't, what do? Mr. Google, right? And then they get the message in 7 seconds. The message that he wants to send. And Clinton said, okay, I got it. And went on to be president of the United States. So now we have a president who is tweeting frequently from the White House and did during the campaign. So he has effectively learned how to manipulate social media and communication in a tight frame in 140 characters. And just as an exercise, I thought, I wonder, and I did this. And guess what? 140 characters. Isn't that amazing? It's way ahead of us. Relevancy is key to winning campaigns, and this is something often overlooked by campaigns. They just, why is it relevant to voters, your message? So I'm going to now show you the most famous ad in American politics. Many of you may have seen it. It's called the Daisy ad. If you asked 1,000 political consultants what the best ad ever made, ever, anywhere, 1,000 would say this ad. There'd be debate over second or third. I've seen this ad 1,000 times, and it still blows me away. But it's deceiving because it blows you away because of the creative element of the ad. It's just so creative and powerful. But the strategy behind it is just as interesting and brilliant. Here's the setup. Lyndon Johnson's running for president. It's late summer of the campaign. Polls come out and are published by newspapers that suggests that not only is Johnson ahead, he's way ahead. And it looks like he's just going to win in a romp. Now, most campaigns would have celebrated that. The Johnson campaign very smartly said this is a problem. Why? Because all of their voters just got the message, well, maybe it's not that important for me to go vote because this thing's in the bag. So I'll just stay home. They were worried that it would have a suppressing effect on their turnout, which was really smart. So they said, we have to do something to raise the stakes, to make this more important for people. And they created an ad that said, if you elect the other guy, there's going to be a nuclear war. Here it is.
told President Johnson on November 3rd, the stakes are too high for you to stay home.
Ooh, vote or die. That's pretty relevant. And Johnson won handily. So, as I said, as I studied presidential campaigns, things are not static and they evolve. It's like voters get used to something, and you know, it's kind of like a virus, and you introduce antibacterials, and it gets used to that, and you have to give it, you know, a new antibacterial to fight it off. So voters are just sophisticated, and they figure out, you know, how they're being persuaded or manipulated, as some may say. Especially, well, here's the deal. I mean, people generally are, in America, not just America, but generally are skeptical about advertising, right? They know it's an ad, they know somebody's paying for it, but they're especially skeptical about political advertising because we have something called the First Amendment, which means that political candidates can say whatever they want, and it doesn't even have to be true, and often it's not. And so voters know that, and they see an ad and they say, well, this is probably somebody not telling me the truth. And so it's a very, very difficult proposition to effectively communicate with voters, especially through advertising. And even when I was doing this back in 2000 and beyond, I would tell the campaign, you know, I'm not sure we should be spending as much money as we do on advertising because I just think voters don't believe it, and we should be doing something else with it. But the advertising that we did do, I realized the communication that works best is communication that is not just perceived as, but hopefully actually is authentic. It's real. What I mean by that, it's not scripted, right? So, as I said, voters are very sophisticated. They can usually tell when a political candidate is reading a script or reading a teleprompter. They're not professional actors or actresses, and they're just not that good at it. And you can usually kind of see that they're reading something. And so therefore it doesn't seem very believable. So the work that I would do, and the work that you see a lot of these days, is that that often it's not scripted. That, like for George W. Bush and for McCain, almost always I do something that was unscripted, that I'd pull it from an interview, I just tease it out of an interview or from a speech that they gave, but it was something spontaneous, that it had a documentary look and feel to it. So the voters would say, yeah, he probably did say that, and does believe that. And as an example of that, so George Bush won the nomination despite New Hampshire in 2000. We lost New Hampshire by 19 points. That's when we thought it was over, but then resurrected. And so got the nomination. And so then the candidates, after they get the nomination, go to the conventions. And at the convention, they have an opportunity to show a biofilm. This is a film about their background because lots of voters haven't been introduced to the candidate, only the voters in the primaries. So the rest of the country gets to see that. And again, this is my job and an important one that I took very seriously. I want to make sure it was as good as it could be. So I was in the process of making this film. I was interviewing George and Laura Bush, and we were at their ranch in Crawford, very relaxed setting. And I had asked them a question about their daughters, and he answered, and he just completely mangled what he was trying to say. Just stepped all over it. And we all laughed. And I said, okay, let's do it again. And we did it like 2 or 3 times until he got it just right. And then a couple weeks later, I'm in editing the film, and we get to that point where he mangles what he's trying to say. And I said, okay, well, let's get the good cut. We put in the good cut. And then I stopped and I said, wait a minute, put the bad one back in. And they're like, what? I said, yeah, put the bad one in. And then now you can imagine the argument that I had with the campaign manager and even the candidate about putting in and intentionally putting into a film a mistake. They're like, are you crazy, McKinnon? I said, no. They said, why? I said, because it's authentic. It's real. This is what people like about you, Governor. They like the fact that you're very human, that you're vulnerable, that you're not perfect, that you're funny. You know, people like that about you, and let's show that side. And by the way, let's just admit that our guy's not the best orator in this race, and let's just lower the bar of expectations now, okay? So this is that moment. I don't have original film on this, so it's a little fuzzy and probably not synced up quite right, but you'll get the idea.
It was a great moment when they were born, and I was in the delivery room, and it was just an incredible feeling of life, and the preciousness of life. And I realized I was responsible. I was responsible for helping them grow up in a safe and secure home. That I was responsible for loving them with all my heart and all my soul. That I was going to be responsible for helping them get a good education. And these girls have mean more to us than anything. They just graduated from high school. It just seems like yesterday that we were in the hospital and birth. I like to laugh, and I like to laugh with people, and you know, sometimes I find myself, I need to laugh at some of the things I say. It's just, I'm a person who likes to smile.
So the moment that that this notion of authenticity really was driven home to me as a really powerful example of how important it is to be authentic was ironically Hillary Clinton in 2008, and it was in New Hampshire. You may remember this moment, some of you pros here. Barack Obama wins Iowa and shocks the nation, shocks the Democratic Party, shocks everybody. And as often happens, he got a bounce from Iowa to New Hampshire. So Hillary Clinton before Iowa was up double digits in New Hampshire. After Iowa, she is suddenly overnight down double digits. And I forget how the election is 10 days later, 2 weeks at the most, whatever it was. And then a day before, or maybe 2 days before the election, there's this moment that happens on the trail. It's a town hall, and she gets asked a very softball question by a supporter, and there is this very human moment, and where she articulates a rationale. She tells a story. It's a very human moment, very documentary. It's authentic. And I remember when it happened because reporters emailed me, and they were saying, "Oh my God, Hillary Clinton teared up on the campaign trail. She's done." And then I saw the video, and I said, I don't know. I kind of like that person. I hadn't seen that person before. And sure enough, one day later, she wins New Hampshire. Direct cause and effect. Here it is.
How do you keep upbeat and so wonderful?
It's not easy. It's not easy. And I couldn't do it if I just didn't, passionately believe it was the right thing to do. I have so many opportunities for this country. I just don't want to see us fall backwards. So, this is very personal for me. It's not just political, it's not just public. I see what's happening. And we have to reverse it. And some people think elections are a game. They think it's like who's up or who's down. It's about our country. It's about our kids' futures. And it's really about all of us together. Some of us put ourselves out there and do this against some pretty difficult odds. And we do it, each one of us, because we care about our country.
So, rationale, story, authenticity, and, remarkably, the only time I really saw that in the last campaign was in her concession speech, where I felt like I really kind of saw that authenticity. And it just, this is a really good example of, you could argue, and I would, to say that it's not always the person with the best ideas who wins. It's the person who's the best communicator. She is a really good ideas person, a really good policy person, and a terrible communicator. She's just not, and she admits that. She says, my husband's the communicator. He's the poet. I'm doing it in prose. But in American politics today, there's a great value that voters give on the power and ability to communicate. And she paid the price for it. In every campaign that I've ever done, arguably the most important moment that you get to communicate your message is when you announce your candidacy. There's like 4 times during a campaign where you really have a huge opportunity to communicate and move the dial. Your announcement speech, the convention, and your choice of the VP or convention speech, and the debates. Those are huge opportunities to move the needle in a big way, but especially the announcement speech, because that's when the press really kind of gives you a free pass. It's not very critical. They just let you say what you're going to say, and that's kind of your day where you get to just do your thing and say, articulate your rationale in your story. So, aware of that importance, those of us who work on campaigns spend a lot of time on that moment and on that speech, the announcement speech. So, in the campaigns that I've done, especially for president, it was not just a weeks-long exercise, it was a months-long exercise getting ready. We'd have 20 drafts back and forth with the candidate, talking about the rationale, talking about the story, making sure it was authentic. And then once we had a draft, then there'd be a rehearsal and there'd be teleprompter, a lot of rehearsal to make sure that it was just right and we'd take maximum opportunity of that event. So imagine our surprise, like I say collective our, the people who've done this in some capacity, when we saw this.
When do we beat Mexico at the border? They're laughing at us. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. They're rapists. Obamacare. $5 billion we spent on a website. I hire people. They do a website. It costs me $3. We need a leader that wrote The Art of the Deal. I will be the greatest jobs president that God ever created. Free trade can be wonderful if you have smart people. But we have people that are stupid. I don't need anybody's money, it's nice. I'm really rich. Obama, a year ago, Yemen was a great victory. 2 weeks later, the place was blown up. The American dream is dead. But if I get elected president, I will bring it back. Bigger and better and stronger than ever before, and we will make America great again. Thank you. Thank you very much.
So, amazing. I don't know if you remember the image of him coming down the escalator at Trump Tower before he delivered the speech. But it's like he thought up that whole thing just as he walked up on the stage. There was no prepared text. There was no teleprompter. He just made it up. The most important moment of a campaign, he just walked up there and just made it up on the spot. And so, just for people in the business, it's like, my gosh, how can you just walk up there and make up something that's so important to your outcome? And you know what? For Trump supporters, that's exactly what they wanted to see. Exactly. Why? Because it didn't look like anything they'd ever seen before, and they didn't want anything they'd ever seen before. They were so tired of politics as usual, they wanted to see a guy walk up on stage and just say what he thought, on the spot, on the moment. Just what's on your mind. So everything about that speech was exactly, even though it's contrary to conventional wisdom, was exactly what his supporters wanted to see. And by the way, you saw how he ended it, with a clear, compelling rationale. So, this has been a fascinating, interesting time for everyone in America. We have 11-year-olds who are studying government now, and I'm amazed. So, no matter where you are on the spectrum for Donald Trump, whether you are a supporter or an opponent or somewhere in between, everybody is fascinated by what's going on. And part of that is just because it's always a surprise, right? I mean, that's good drama is about, we don't know the end of the story. We don't know what the story is going to be. And so with Donald Trump, you wake up almost every day and there's something new and surprising that we haven't seen before. So people are transfixed. So many years ago, having worked in campaigns, and I loved them. I just thought they were fascinating and interesting ecosystems of drama and characters, most of which the public never sees. And I thought, man, it'd be so interesting if the public could see this. And not just interesting, I thought it'd be informative. I thought it'd be helpful for people to see not just the candidates, but to see them behind the scenes when their guard was down, to see their families, to see the characters in the campaign, what they were all about, that it would be enlightening. And so I came up with this idea of a real-time political documentary to shoot behind the scenes, but roll it up as it was happening. And it took years and years for me to sell the idea. It wasn't the idea that was difficult to sell, it was the execution. People in Hollywood said, man, it's a great idea, but I don't think you can do it. And luckily it took years because actually we needed the technology to catch up. But in mid-2015, after having been, in 100 meetings and conversations where it was on, it was off, it was on, it was off, it was on, it was off, then Showtime showed up and said, we love it, let's do it. And they said, not only do they want to do it, they want to do 26 episodes, which is a lot of TV. And so the challenge is that real-time documentary meant real-time. Some of the other people that we talked to about doing it said, well, how about quarterly or monthly? And I said, no, it has to be weekly, because if it's monthly, it'll be ancient. And so you have to feel like you're in the cockpit of the campaign as the campaign's happening. But Showtime got that, and they were, and then as you can see why that'd be a challenge for a TV network executive, right? Because all other shows that they produce and put on their network, they see weeks, if not months ahead of time. Showtime sees the Circus Sunday morning, the night it goes up. That's when they see the show, the morning before it goes up that night. So that's a big gamble for network executives. But Showtime got it and signed us up, and so as I said, 26 episodes for the campaign. When they said 26 episodes, I thought, oh my gosh, first of all, it's going to be really hard to do, because we basically create a documentary that people usually have months, if not years, to produce, and we got to do it in a week. That's just going to be hard work, which it was incredibly hard. It's the hardest I've ever worked by far. But I also thought, wow, 26 episodes, there's just going to be weeks where not that much is going on. That never happened, ever. In fact, the only challenge every week was cutting stuff, because there was so much would happen. And to my point about the timetable, usually by Thursday or Friday, the stuff we shot Monday or Tuesday was like, oh my God, kill that. That was like a lifetime ago. And so as we all know, it turned out to be a really surprising campaign. But I thought that was that. I said, okay, well, great, I got to do this idea, I got to do it, and it exceeded my expectations. Great, and goodbye. And then 3 weeks into the Trump administration, the president of Showtime called and said, get back out there, man, the circus hadn't stopped. So, and I was at first quite skeptical about it. I said, I don't know, the campaign was cinematic, it's all over the country, it's, just stuff happening every day. Washington's boring and it's static, and I was wrong in many ways. So we shot a second season out of Washington, really mostly kind of around the first 100 days. And it was different, but in many ways it was even more interesting, I think, because for people it was real. Now it wasn't just like theoretical in a campaign, it was like real life Washington stuff. And to my point earlier, everybody's paying attention. And, we have, 11-year-olds who know about executive orders. And governing by presidential fiat rather than by legislative agreement. So the show went really well, and so we had to take a break because mostly because my co-hosts were writing a book. And so then, as you may have read, one of my co-hosts got caught up in this recent sexual harassment allegations and is paying the price for that, and he's no longer going to be part of this show or any other shows or the book. Mark Halpern, who's a big fan of this place, has been here many times. So, but the most recent meeting with Showtime, just to give you the full update, is that they really love the show, and they think that we can go on and just replace with a co-host, with somebody we have in mind. And so I think there's a very good chance that the show will be back next year, maybe for even 2 installments, maybe a spring installment, maybe something in the fall covering the show. But it's a fascinating, interesting time in American politics. So it's great to be here at the hot core of American politics, to be with you all. And I'm happy to answer questions for as long as you'd like. Well, boy, you'd get a lot of seconds on that nomination. He said he nominated Steve Schmidt, who you may know from MSNBC mostly these days. But that's why when I talk about characters in politics, he was like one of the greatest characters of all time. I mean, Steve was like an inspiration for me to do this show. It's like people need to see more of guys like this, because he's smart and he's passionate, and so I spent a lot of time with him on the John McCain campaign, and he was really good. He was really good, really smart. But that's exactly the kind of person that we'd want to drop in the slot.
I got a degree from St. A's and some graduate work at UT.
All right. All right.
The same age, you might have been there.
Very, very likely, yeah.
At any rate, I'm just wondering how big you think this sexual harassment thing is going to get. I suspect there's going to be a whole lot of congressmen,
Yeah.
like Al Franken, senators, and things like that. But more of this is going to come up.
It is. So my view broadly on this is that the pendulum is swinging late, hard, and fast. Later than it should have, but really hard and really fast now. And I'm not naive about this to think that this sort of thing is not going to take place in the future. It will. It is part of human nature, unfortunately, some prehistoric nature. But I do think that thanks to what is happening right now, that it's going to be a very different culture moving forward. I think that women or men who are harassed or assaulted will feel much more free and encouraged to speak up when things happen. And because they speak up when things happen, things won't happen as much. Or if they do, they'll be penalized immediately. So every day you read a new development on this front, right? In Hollywood or in corporate America or today in the Senate with Al Franken. So one of the things that I'm going to be interested to watch is, this is a brush fire that's going to just, it's going to burn hot, and it's going to burn for a while, as it should. And I think, I don't think there'll be any industry or, area of American life that this won't touch in some way. The question is that'll be interesting to watch is, well, for example, it'll be interesting to see what happens with Al Franken, right? Because what people are going to start asking questions about is proportionality. It's like, do we burn everybody at the stake, or does somebody get a second chance, or does one sort of conduct okay and others isn't? One's forgivable, one's not. That's what I think is going to kind of shake out. And so the Franken case is a kind of an interesting one because it's a little bit different. And in this case, I don't know if you read the latest, but the accuser has accepted his apology. So that's kind of an interesting twist on it, because I don't think we've seen that before. And it's going to, I think, the Senate Ethics Committee, and I don't think we've had that happen. So, but it's just an example that, if there's if something's occurred, it's likely now to be, we're gonna litigate it as a society and as a culture, and I think it's going to take a while for us to shake this all out and figure out, where it all lands. But I think in the overall scheme of things, that it is a very positive development long term. Yes,
if anybody wants to ask a question, can you please just come over here? We're going to form a nice line and use the microphone. Is this on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Mark, for a very interesting presentation.
Sure, thanks for being here.
For all the adjectives some of us could use to describe Donald Trump's presidency, I would just like to say ineffective. He had a number of campaign bulletins, I don't know, 8 or 9 anyway, that he talked about, none of which so far I think have come to pass, from the deportation to the wall to health care, on down the line. He's hit every single one of them, but nothing's come to pass yet. So I'd call him at least ineffective. I always like to see a silver lining, and I like to think that from this whole presidency, that the next time around that we will learn what to look for and ask for and demand of our candidates. He hasn't done anything on the board illegal. Tax return. You don't have to turn in a tax return. It's just that everybody always did.
Yeah.
And he just didn't. So yeah, that's okay. Having 4,000 lawsuits pending when you go into office. I don't know how many any other president had, but it wasn't a big deal. Some of the other things that he had, family, adult children getting classified information access. That seems like it shouldn't be just an automatic thing. So I'm doing a live talking here, but those are things I guess I'd like your reaction to.
Sure.
What we should demand the next time around.
Yeah, interesting. The tax returns is one that it seems to me would just. I think a lot of people are surprised that was a requirement, that somebody running for president wouldn't have to disclose that. And I was I worked for Ann Richards, who was governor of Texas, maybe around the time when you were there. And she came from way behind in that race for the Republican nominee who was very popular and was 20 points ahead. And then at the very end of the campaign, we had been demanding that he disclose his tax returns, and he wouldn't, and then finally he cracked one day, kind of for reasons we didn't quite understand, but she just was so effective. He said, "Oh yeah," he said, "Yeah, no, actually, in 1986, I didn't pay any taxes because I lost a bunch of money." Well, voters, this guy was a billionaire. And it's like, well, wait a minute, you didn't pay any taxes? So that just seemed fundamentally unfair to him, and 20 points were evaporated overnight. But, that goes to, there's so many places I could go with that particular thing, including where the Mueller investigation may be going, that could eventually wind up there in some capacity, in other words, his tax returns or connections to foreign government business. The interesting thing that I'm interested to see is, so you're right. On the big things that he promised, so far, none of them have been achieved. And we're a year into we're a year into the election. So a year, nothing done. No wall, none of the major things that he proposed. And yet, his supporters are with him like glue. And that's another new thing. I mean, normally that'd be the sort of thing where people would say, well, wait, you didn't do what you're saying to do. Again, I think for Trump supporters, it's more style than substance. It's like, well, it's the Republican Congress that's screwed up. It's that Mitch McConnell guy. He's trying, but it's at Washington D.C. It's just all screwed up, and he's doing things on the as I said, the executive front, where he's doing things just that a president can do through regulation on environmental regulations. I don't know if you, again, another development today, and maybe I read this wrong, because it's hard for me to believe that he is rolling back the prohibition against the importation of elephant tusks. What's the rationale for that? How could you do that? I don't get that, so I guess I'll have to. Anyway, but yes, I think that Donald Trump is going to not only change the presidency, he already has. I mean, we're testing the guardrails of democracy. I think a lot of people, me included, have said this. This is going to really test what our forefathers have done in terms of putting up to see, what could presidents get away with? How far can they push executive authority? So I think that's something Congress is really thinking about. And if we get a Democratic House or a Democratic Senate, I think they're going to weigh in on a lot of that stuff. They may make, for example, tax returns are a requirement of the next nominee of both parties. So I think he's not only changed what presidents do and how they do it. I think he's going to change for sure the way presidents run in the future. So hugely impactful on so many levels. But all those questions are important ones that a lot of people are thinking about. Thanks.
Hi.
Hi.
I was a big fan of the Circus.
Thank you for watching.
I'm happy to know it's coming back. So in the absence of Mark Halpern, will John Heilman still be part of the future?
Likely, yes.
Okay. And could there be like a Carville Begala component to that, or does it have to be more like a journalist as opposed to a political pundit?
Good question. It's still an open question. It hasn't been decided yet, but I will just say that I have, from the very beginning, been pushing for more diversity, and maybe somebody born in the last half century. So,
good point.
But good thoughts. Thank you.
Hi. In my media and politics class that I'm in right now, the professor will often walk in and he'll say, "What story broke on my way to class?" which we kind of laugh about, but today was a point in case where the Al Franken story broke when he was actually walking from his office to class. So I was kind of wondering if you could walk us through the editorial process you go through, because you mentioned, this is a weekly show that you're developing. So I can imagine, you think you've got it packaged up and you think you've got the focus, but then next thing you know, a new story is broken. So how do you kind of deal with that, and how do you package up each week's episode?
Really good question. So one of the things that I learned from Hollywood is, again, the importance of storytelling. So when I pitched this concept, and I thought, well, this is just a presidential campaign, and just really interesting stuff happens, and we'll just put that on the air. They said, no. That's not how we do it. So every show is going to have a theme. There's going to be like a storyline narrative to the show. There's going to be like a backbone. And there'll be side stories that kind of break up. But we want you to connect those as best you can to the theme of the week. So, for example, one of the best shows that we did, and if we had more time, I'd show it to you, but Mark had a really great idea kind of midway through all this, and he said, you know, this Russian story is kind of interesting, and my spidey sense says there's something more to this. Let's do an episode from Moscow. Let's go there. We'll call the episode From Russia with Love, and we'll kind of interview who we can and just kind of see this election through the eyes of the Kremlin and Russia, which I thought was brilliant. Interestingly, Russia wouldn't give us visas. And so we didn't, but Mark wouldn't give up. He's intrepid as can be. And so he said, okay, I'm going to go to London and I'm going to stalk Julian Assange, the head of WikiLeaks. I was like, what? It just seems so crazy to me and expensive too. And I said, okay. And as it turned out, it was like the best episode of the whole series and the best scene that he shot in Knightsbridge, London at night, stalking Julian Assange at the Ecuadorian embassy. So this is the founder of WikiLeaks who, as you may know, is like under extradition from 3 different countries, you know, all kinds of, you know, alleged violations and what have you. And so he can't leave the building. And he's been in the Ecuadorian embassy for a couple of years. But Mark got a note. He didn't get into him, but he found a guy who he figured out was connected to him and got a message into Assange and got a message back out, got his question answered, and it was all filmed. It was very cool. But that whole show was had that Russian theme, and as it was important because I learned so much during that show just about, you know, this whole notion of, you know, it could be. Remember the response was, oh, it could have been anybody. It could be a 400-pound guy in his basement, right? Remember that? Well, we talked to, you know, the best analysts in the world, intelligence analysts, and every one of them said 100% Russia, 100%. No doubt about this at all. And so an interesting footnote to that, it was reported to me that even before the show aired, WikiLeaks hacked Showtime and got the show. That's how they roll. It's a little scary. But more to the point of your question. So yeah, so we'd have a theme and we'd be like rolling down the road on it. And sometimes, often, like just, well, here's an example. So we decided we're going to do a show on Joe Biden, which the Showtime was great with us. Like 95% of the time they were like, great idea, you guys go with it. And they were really smart. They hired a guy from politics who kind of oversaw the show, and he got it, and it wasn't the usual. I thought there'd be like lots of disagreements with the suits. They were just smart. The guys said, great. And when they disagreed, they said, you're the guys in the field, we trust you. The one time they disagreed was when we wanted to do a show about Joe Biden, because this was kind of, you know, this is well after the primaries and into the fall, and they're like, well, that's not really, you know, why? And, you know, it's not really topical right now. And I certainly understood their argument and expected it. You know, they wanted to be like, news of the day, what's happening? And we said, well, no, we just think Biden's an important character and an interesting one, and we want to do this. So we did it, and the whole show was supposed to be about Biden. And then on Thursday night, the Access Hollywood tapes broke. So 3/4 into the way on the show on Joe Biden, Access Hollywood. But, you know, which kind of took a huge turn in the show, which was kind of jarring. But so was the campaign, and it just reflected the campaign, but it also just showed how we had to be, you know, ready to move on a dime. But by the way, footnote, Showtime ended up loving the show on Biden, and we got great. Again, it was one of the better shows that we did. And now, given everything that we know looking back about everything that happened, it's even kind of more important and interesting now, that episode about Biden. Thanks.
Sorry, I'm short. Okay. I'm not sure if you're aware of the show Frontline.
Yeah, sure.
Oh, so I recently watched that show with my dad, the one titled Putin's Revenge. And I actually have two questions for you. So, what do you think of the correlation between fake news in Russia regarding Putin and fake news in the United States regarding Donald Trump?
Really good question. So what's the name of the documentary? Putin's Revenge?
Yes.
Well, first of all, Frontline does amazing, amazing work. I haven't seen that one, but I'll go look for it.
I recommend it.
Pardon me?
I recommend it.
Okay, thank you. And the reason that I'm interested not only for the obvious reasons, but I'm also there's something called the Peabody Awards, and I'm a judge for the Peabody Awards, and we award a lot of stuff to Frontline. I mean, they're just every year they're at the head of the pack of things that we award, and so was that just produced in the last year or so? Do you know, or is it relatively new? Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So that will probably be a submission for us that we'll be looking at next year. But I also saw another documentary just this week that somebody had recommended called Icarus. Has anybody seen that? It's about Russian doping. It was about doping in sports generally, but then it evolves into the Russian doping scandal. Anyway, it goes directly to Putin, and again, it's just kind of, you see what happens when state sponsors activity like that. So it's a really good question, and I think in many ways this election is so consequential on so many levels, but I think that question may be the most consequential, which is, what is the impact of fake news? So we have two things that are happening, right? We have real news that is we are told is fake, and we have fake news that we're told is real. So I'll start with the second one first. Fake news that, so for example, in the election, there were a bunch of teenagers in Macedonia who very artfully pumped in fake stories into websites, platforms, and social media in America that were anti-Hillary Clinton and pro-Donald Trump. And they made a lot of money doing it. They'd get clicks and then they get revenue. And so a bunch of Macedonian teenagers made a bunch of money by pumping fake news into an American election. Now, there's a lot of focus and discussion on that issue specifically, but also more broadly in the sense that there are hearings in Congress with Facebook and Google, and how can we make sure this doesn't happen in the future? And I think that there's this is kind of my optimistic self. I'm a prisoner of hope, but I think one of the positive outcomes of this is that we only discovered this really after the election, that there was all this fake news out there. And I think for a lot of people, they say, oh, wow, there's a lot of news out there that's not real. I better be more discerning about my habits, about what I read, and make sure. And so I think for the most part, we have more discerning readers and viewers. And I think that what's going to happen is that there's going to be a flight to quality branded journalism. And by that I mean people are just going to be wary of like websites and platforms that they don't know, that they're not familiar with, and they're going to go to ones that they are familiar with, Yahoo News or whatever it might be, but something that's been around for a while and that has lots of resources. And so ironically, this is really ironic now, the failing New York Times, and the is having a heyday in terms of subscriptions are up a lot, and they're up a lot for the Washington Post. So it's in many ways it's kind of a golden era of journalism for those big branded enterprises for journalism, in part I think because of that notion that people are looking for quality journalism. The second one, which is when you have a commander-in-chief who is telling people that real news is fake, is a much is a much broader question, and I don't have the answer for that. I mean, I think it's on precedent in America anyway. I mean, it's the kind of thing you'd see in a third world or a dictatorship or an authoritarian government, where anything critical of the leader is judged to be fake, and a lot of people believe him. And so, I mean, I don't know why somebody would believe that every single other media outlet in the country is fake and only one is real, because it just says positive things about him, but that appears to be the case with a lot of people. I don't know when or how that dam breaks, because it's been very effective for him. I mean, it's been very effective for Donald Trump to just say, fake news. He doesn't like something, it's fake. And but this goes to, again, like you just tapped the well, I think, of a huge, big issues, not going to be solved anytime soon. But it also testifies to this notion we just have a country today in which people undergo what I call confirmation bias, which means that they're just looking for any information that confirms what they already think. They don't want new information. They don't want information that disagrees with them. They just want to reinforce what they already believe. And so we have, it's not just Fox, but, you could argue that MSNBC is very, lefty-leaning, and so, people get their, may just get all their news from that. So it's not like the old days where we had sort of just 3 choices. We have 100 choices, and people will find those that just reinforce what they already believe. So it's not a good outlook for expanded thinking. So I just touched on a little bit of your very good question, but I do think it's a big, big deal on a lot of fronts, and we're going to be grappling with it for a long time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for speaking. So I just have 2 questions. My first is, how do you see the 2016 election changing the professional political kind of campaign industry, from pollsters to consultants, just kind of writ large? And the second is, we do feel like there's a surge of activism right now in the political sphere in reaction to some pretty strong personalities. What do you see as the long-term trajectory of, are people actually going to engage in the political process, or are people losing optimism that the system is worth investing in as opposed to just opposing or supporting personalities?
Mm-hmm. One of the things that is a question that we can't know yet is how much has Donald Trump changed everything, or changed things just because it's Donald Trump, or has he changed things because things have changed? In other words, can somebody replicate what Donald Trump has done? Some things have happened which, your question is kind of around the political professional class. I mean, he in some ways reinforced what I was saying about authenticity in advertising, right? He didn't do that much advertising. He didn't have to. I think he thought it was a waste of money, just like I do. You think that people doesn't believe it, so he didn't do much. I mean, not nearly as much as his opponents did. And he frankly didn't really use professional pollsters. I mean, he had pollsters. There were people polling that weren't well known, but I mean, it was more on instinct. So people are always going to look at what happened. But again, kind of my earlier point, if you're just looking in the rearview mirror, everything's changing. And to your questions, I think, there's going to be a reverse effect of all that. People are going to do exactly what he didn't do. I mean, depending on sort of how this shakes out after, but, 1 year in, you'd say, well, maybe the person who wins the next election is going to do things completely different because people are going to be unhappy with the outcome that they got. So what was the second half of your question?
Just about whether you think that the current surge of activism is sustainable or...
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think I think this election galvanized everybody, and I think that, again, on both sides. I think if you're, my daughters were not particularly political before; they are now, and I think we saw a little bit of this in the Virginia elections that just happened. I think we're going to see a lot of it in the midterms, but I think. I think a lot of people, we had a pretty lethargic electorate generally, just in terms of turnout and people who vote. And I think a lot of people thought, well, my vote doesn't matter. Well, they looked at the last election and said, well, maybe it does now. Maybe it could have. Maybe I should have. But, you know, there's a couple of elections in the last decade or so in which, you know, just thousands of votes made a difference. And again, just because of the nature of this election, because of our polarization, people are highly activated, highly energized. So I think that that's going to have a short-term and a long-term effect. I don't think that fire is going out anytime soon. It's certainly not before 2020. And now I'll end, because I don't think we have any more questions, right? So I'll end on, everybody kind of wants to know about 2020, but I'll let you ask your question first, and then I'll do my 2020.
Well, I guess it's appropriate. The question kind of relates to the future, but I'm curious, with your perspective, how you see the communication landscape, you know, how it's evolved and changed with social media and online advertising for politics, what you think the implications might be for future of political advertisements, and how you think folks might communicate in the future, what those implications are.
Well, I mean, I think it's been revolutionized, and I think that the first thing people should do is just make an assumption that, again, it kind of goes back to, but even more stronger than I ever would have said or thought before, that you know, don't just look at what we did in the past. You know, kind of reinvent the future like Donald Trump did, and just said, I'm not going to play by conventional rules. I think the thing that will go forward is that people are, you know, they're questioning tradition. The tradition the way we did it before. I think 30-second ads are gone. I mean, I think sort of broadcast television ads are like, you know, that's out with the dinosaurs. I just don't think that we're going to see that. But viral kind of video that's, you know, Snapchatted or, you know, put through social media platforms. We know that social media has an enormous impact, that people are much more likely to be influenced by friends on Facebook than they are by a TV ad, right? So that's why the whole Facebook issue is so interesting about, you know, if you can put out any kind of information through Facebook, how do we regulate that? And I've been involved in some reform organizations, and we're kind of in the middle of that a little bit, just to say, well, if you have to disclose on TV that an ad is paid for by somebody, shouldn't you have to disclose that on Facebook? I mean, millions and millions of people are seeing it on Facebook. Why shouldn't there be a requirement for people that are sending a political message to reveal who they are? So I think that's something we can look forward to. But I think, you know, the social media platforms have created a wild frontier, and Donald Trump used it masterfully. And so I think that, you know, the social media platforms are going to be key to whatever it is, and the conventional stuff is, I think, out the window. You know, I don't think I'd even have a job in a future presidential campaign because they're just not going to do that anymore. So those kind of things. Thanks. So 2020 could make 2016 look like a pretty tame circus. You know, we may just be getting for a real rodeo coming. Because you think about it, let's start with this. On November 9th, after the election was on the 8th, which I think it was, everybody in America who's a millionaire woke up and said, I could do that, right? I mean, Mark Zuckerberg, Oprah Winfrey, Mark Cuban, Howard Schultz, you know, literally, they all, I assure you, across their mind, they said, well, gee, if Donald Trump could do it, I could do it. All you need is a bunch of money. I got a bunch of money, so I could be president. And so that conversation is happening with a lot of people. So if you got a bunch of money, you maybe think about running for president. So we got that whole basket full of people. If you're a Democrat with any ambition, you're running for president, right? Because it's wide open. It's an open seat. So anybody who kind of wants, I mean, the one way to get your name out there and get a bunch of media interest is run for president. I mean, that was Donald Trump's original thing, right? By the way, he never expected to be president. I assure you, I know this. It's not my opinion. He didn't think he was going to be president. He was just going to go out there and have fun and get a bunch of attention and media and go back to his business. So, you know, anybody, like I said, any Democrat with ambition, that means any Democrat who holds office, basically, right? If they want their name in the mix and to get in the headlines and the headlights, they're going to run for president. So, I mean, that list is already 30 or 40 people long of elected officials, Congress people or senators. You know, so they're all in the mix. And so But here's the scenario that I think could play out, which is that the Democrats have a very crowded primary, and just given the general direction of the Democratic environment these days, it could likely be somebody very progressive that wins the nomination, say Elizabeth Warren or somebody like that. And then Donald Trump, I believe, will run for re-election, barring some intervention of some kind, legal or otherwise. And the reason that he'll run again is because he has to go out a winner, right? He's not going to like walk away and say, "Oh, I couldn't win re-election." That's just not in his psychology. Even if he hated the job, he wouldn't do it. It's just not his psychology, because people would say, "Oh, geez, he couldn't even get reelected." So I think just psychologically, I think it's his profile that he would just have to run again. And I think he'd be darn near impossible to beat in the primaries. Trump supporters are with him like glue. They're not going anywhere. And so, you know, it's not a majority of voters, but it's a very strong plurality. You know, whatever that number is, 25, 30%, they love the guy and they're not going anywhere. And so in a Republican primary, that's really hard to beat when you've got a base that strong. It's you know, it's going to be very difficult. So what I think that means is that there will be establishment Republicans who will be unhappy with that choice or unhappy with the Republican Party under Donald Trump, and somebody will run as an independent. But there'll be an establishment Republican. It'll be somebody like John Kasich, for example. Yeah, and they could do a unity ticket. So they could do a, you know, it could be John Kasich, and this is something that's already been mentioned, him at the top of the ticket, and Governor John Hickenlooper from Colorado, who's a Democrat, as the VP, and have this kind of dream unity ticket. So that'd be an interesting race, right? So you could see how that could split up and could get very interesting. So I think there'll be a good chance that the Circus will be there covering it for you. All right, thank you.